Good afternoon. I'm Vicki Wilkins, the Dean of the School of Public Affairs at American University. Welcome to today's annual Amos Perlmutter Lecture. I want to thank my colleague Saul Newman from the School of Public Affairs for his moderation of this event, and Michael Brenner and Laura Cutler from the Center for Israel Studies for partnering with us to organize this event. Today, we welcome Tzipi Livni, former Vice Prime Minister of Israel and former Minister of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for being with us today and welcome to AU. But we are also here today to pay tribute to a beloved former SPA professor, Amos Perlmutter. For those not familiar with Amos Perlmutter, you may actually think of him as the most interesting man, an amazing mix of scholar, teacher, and public intellectual. Amos was a professor at American University from 1972 until his death in 2001. Professor Perlmutter was an expert in comparative politics and foreign affairs. During his career, he published 15 books, including FDR and Stalin, A Not So Grand Alliance, 1943 to 1945, and The Military and Politics in Modern Times. His career included roles as a member of the Israeli delegation to the UN, as a political advisor to the Chief of Staff and High Command of the Israeli Defense Forces, an advisor to the Greek government, a member of the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, an author of a weekly column for the Washington Times, a fellow at the Brookings Institute, and at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. He was also the founder and editor of the Journal of Strategic Studies. His contribution to American University and the world community enriched the field of comparative politics. And with his bigger-than-life personality, he was a hit in the classroom and with television analysts. People loved to have Amos with them because of his savvy and expertise and his interest in Middle East peace talks and elections in Israel and world leaders. SPA and the Center for Israel Studies are pleased to honor his contribution in memory through an endowment in his name, which supports this lecture. Thank you all today for joining us as we pay tribute to his amazing legacy, and welcome Ms. Livni. I'm now very pleased to introduce you to American University's Professor Michael Brenner. He is a distinguished historian in residence and the director of the Center of Israel Studies. Dr. Brenner previously taught at Indiana and Brandeis universities and has had a visiting appointment at numerous universities around the world. Among his long list of accomplishments, Brenner is an elected fellow to the Bavarian Academy of Sciences and the American Academy for Jewish Research. I'd like to welcome Dr. Brenner to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And on behalf of the Center for Israel Studies, which was actually inaugurated as the first one of its kind in the United States by the late Shimon Peres in 1998, it is my pleasure to welcome you all at this year's Perlmutter Lecture. I would very much like to thank School of Public Affairs Dean Vicki Wilkins for her deep engagement in our cooperation on this lecture and on many other academic affairs over many years. I also want to take this opportunity to briefly introduce Associate Dean Saul Newman, who will be today's moderator. Professor Newman received his PhD from Princeton University, has taught at AU for many years, and he was also a colleague of Amos Perlmutter. He's also taught at Bar-Ilan University. His research deals, among many other topics, with the decline of settler nationalism in South Africa, Northern Ireland, and Israel, and its impact on resolving disputes between settler and native nationalist movements. Professor Newman will ask the first questions after today's lecture and will channel the questions from the audience to our speaker. And before introducing our speaker, let me say also a few words about the Center for Israel Studies. It is the task of our center to promote knowledge of Israel across many disciplines and from a variety of perspectives. We offer courses on Arab-Israeli relations and on Israel's history, on Israel's Palestinian citizens and on Israeli theater, and on many other topics. Our annual international conferences range from topics such as religion and state relations to water resources in the region, and from the kibbutz history to the treatment of refugees and asylum seekers. Our speakers only in this past year included, besides many leading academics, former Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben-Ami. We hosted President Yitzhak Herzog and Palestinian politician and activist Hanan Ashrawi. The center does not promote any political views. Instead, we want to present to our campus and to the broader community a multitude of opinions and serve as a bridge between the many parties in this complex society. In the spirit of American University, we invite you to listen and discuss, and that means not only to opinions you agree with, but also those you might disagree with. And if you're not yet a friend of the center or on our mailing list, please consult our website where many of our recorded events are accessible. And the topic of Israel as a Jewish democratic state is indeed a very hot one these days. Israel is seen by many as the only democracy in the Middle East, but it's also often characterized as an occupational power controlling Palestinian citizens. Only last week, Amnesty International called Israel an apartheid state, which in turn was heavily criticized not only by Israel, but by Jewish and other organizations worldwide. And as we speak, the passing of a citizenship law is being discussed that would renew a ban on permits for Palestinians who marry Israelis to live with their spouses in Israel. And we've heard from some observers who fear that while the Jewish dimension of the state is growing, its democratic component may be in danger of shrinking. In the last 3 years, Israel went through 4 elections, and its former longtime prime minister is indicted on charges of breach of trust, bribery, and fraud. Today, Israel is governed by a broad coalition reaching from rightist to leftist parties, and for the first time, also integrating an Arab party. With all its external and internal challenges, it might actually be a surprise for many that Israel's democracy is still going strong, while democracies in states like Hungary, Poland, and Turkey have been in decay, and even the democracy in this country, in the United States, is under serious threat. We invited as our Perlmutter lecturer this year someone who can speak to this topic from more angles than probably anyone else. Former Israeli foreign minister, justice minister, and opposition leader, Tzipi Livni. After her career as a lawyer, Mrs. Livni entered the Knesset originally as a member of the Likud party before following then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon into the new Kadima party and becoming vice prime minister in the Olmert cabinet. In the 2009 election, her centrist party emerged as the strongest in the Israeli parliament elections, but due to the rightist party's majority, she was blocked from forming a coalition under her leadership as prime minister. She became instead the leader of the center-left opposition. In 2013-14, Livni led the Israeli negotiation team in peace talks with the Palestinians, so far the last serious round of negotiations between the two parties. For the 2015 elections, she formed the Zionist Union together with the Labour Party in order to oust Prime Minister Netanyahu. And in 2019, she did not run for the Knesset anymore. Tzipi Livni is arguably the most important woman in Israeli politics since the late Prime Minister Golda Meir. Among her many international honors bestowed on her, I will only mention her being named a Chubb Fellow at Yale University, a Fisher Family Fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School, and she also received the International Hall of Fame Award from the International Women's Forum. She probably is not aware of one special honor she received at American University. While being the leader of the Israeli opposition against the Netanyahu government, a group of AU students formed a Tzipi Livni fan club here on campus, which I remember vividly. I hope that some of these former students, as well as those students who take a critical stance about Israel's policies, are among our attendants today to listen and to discuss to what Ms. Livni has to say on Israel as a Jewish democratic state, vision and challenges. And now the floor is finally yours, Madam Foreign Minister.
I think that you can hear and see me now. Thank you for your words, and hello for the club that was established when I was in power. I'm outside of politics, but still quite involved or still believe in my vision for the future of the State of Israel. Well, the State of Israel was established 74 years ago, and just a few months before the State of Israel was established, the United Nations adopted the partition plan in order to solve the conflict between Jews and Arabs in this tiny place between Jordan River, Mediterranean Sea. And the idea was that the only way to solve the conflict is to establish two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. On a personal note, my parents were members of the Irgun. They fought against the British mandate in order to establish the Jewish state. And when the United Nations partition plan was accepted, for them it was on one hand quite a joy. The world accepted the idea of a Jewish state, but yet they believed in Greater Israel, in the rights of the Jewish people on the entire land. But when Ben-Gurion decided to accept the partition plan and established the State of Israel, altogether, all the different parts of the Jewish leadership signed the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. And what my parents did next is that they got married. So basically, they are the first couple who got married in the independent state of Israel. And the next day, my father joined the army. When the State of Israel was established as a Jewish state, part of its principles, declaration, and identity was to be established as a democratic state. And since that day, when we are speaking about Israel, we say that Israel is a Jewish democratic state. It looks like the common denominator, but yet there's a huge dispute and completely different opinions. What does it mean? I mean, we all know what democracy is. And frankly, as was mentioned before, we see different trends and erosion in nature of democracies all over the world. And also in Israel, we had some disputes. What does it mean to be a democracy? Does it mean to include as part of our basic law the value of equality? But it's more difficult to understand what does it mean to be a Jewish state, since Israel is the only Jewish state in the world. And it's beautiful to see Israel and its diversity, but yet when we have different tribes or different parts of the Israeli community, we have completely different visions and understanding of the meaning of being a Jewish state. The ultra-Orthodox religious guys, they think that being a Jewish state means a religious state, a halachic state. For others, being a Jewish state, it means that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people as peoplehood, from a national perspective, not a religious one. And we have 20% of Israeli Arabs that for them, the feeling is that the nature of Israel as a Jewish state means that it threatens their equal rights within the state of Israel. So we have two words that means completely different things to different parts of Israeli society. And this is just one of the challenges that we are facing, because since the State of Israel was established, there was never a peaceful moment. Since 48, later 67, 73, Yom Kippur War, attacks by terror, and until now we need to address threats that are coming basically from extremists in the region, including Iran, its proxies in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and within the Palestinian Authority, we are having Hamas controlling Gaza Strip. But more than that, since 1967, and since we are keeping the territories, there's a huge gap between Israel and the international community, because when we are looking at the region, we are looking at Israel from a satellite point of view, bird eye point of view. So we feel that we are the Davids of the region. Small states surrounded by enemies. I'll speak also about Abraham Accords, but yet when the world is looking at Israel, it looks at Israel from a Google Earth point of view. What the world sees is the Israeli soldier or the Israeli tank or aircraft and the Palestinian child. And therefore, for them, we are the aggressor, and it's very humane to feel empathy to the weak side of the conflict. So for many years, the outside world is looking at Israel through the lenses of the conflict, sometimes distorted lenses of the conflict. It is also affects the situation in Israel, the nature of democracy, the policy of some Israeli governments, affects the relations between Israel and the world Jewry. And I believe that we need to open a new dialogue, because what was obvious when the State of Israel was established is not obvious anymore. When the grandparents cried with joy when the State of Israel was established, and their children were horrified when Israel was under attacks, their grandchildren, maybe part of you, sometimes feel alienated to the State of Israel, don't understand what is the nature of the state, feel that Israel is more Jewish, more religious, less democratic. And therefore, I believe that it's crucial to have this internal dialogue within Israel, to open a new dialogue between Israel and the world Jewry, and also to have another dialogue between Israel and the international community. There are some changes. I think that more and more are looking at Israel as a startup nation, quite appreciating the innovation within Israel. From speaking about security, Israel is a strong state. And the good news in the last years was our Abraham Accords with the Gulf states, Arab states, and basically normalizing and changing strategically the situation of Israel in the region. I fully support Abraham Accords, and for many years as a foreign minister, I had discreet relations with leaders of the Arab world. And for many years, the message coming from the Arab world was that they would not normalize their relations with Israel without peace between Israel and the Palestinians. So there was this linkage that was broken when they agreed to have normalization with Israel. But yet, something that I believe is not good news is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was abandoned. And it was mentioned that we passed 4 rounds of elections in Israel, and frankly, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was not on the table. The need to achieve an agreement, peace treaty with the Palestinians was not discussed. And when the Israeli government formed, it was agreed between the different fractions of this government, as was mentioned, from left wing to right wing, including an Arab party. They agreed not to touch sensitive issues, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the most sensitive issue when it comes to Israeli politics. I will refer to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I believe, or my vision, or my position regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is connected to my vision for the State of Israel. Because my vision is not about the Palestinians, it's not about 2 states for 2 peoples, but it's about the existence of Israel as a Jewish democratic state. So I believe that the meaning of Jewish democratic state is that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. I believe that equality is a Jewish value. I believe that the monopoly of the Jewishness of the State of Israel should not be given to the rabbinates because it's not a religious matter. I believe that we should discuss it amongst us within the Jewish people, those who live in Israel and those who live outside of Israel. And since I believe that equality is a Jewish value, I mean, love thy neighbor is not written in the American Constitution, it's part of our values. And not to say that equality and civil rights are part of the nature of democracy, because this is also in dispute in Israel, because some would express their views about democracy that majority rules. It's not a matter of values, but it's a matter of majority. But when I regard equality as a Jewish values, and of course, democracy is a matter of values and rights that majority need to preserve, I can have these two values of the state of Israel as a Jewish democratic state living in harmony and not in contradiction. Having said that, when this is our vision, it also is the tension between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, the minority within Israel, because it means that while Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, they have, as Israeli citizens, equal rights like each and every Israeli Jew. Now, this is not just a theoretical issue that I'm expressing, speaking about values. It is important, but when this is written on the wall, when this is the vision, my decision, or the decision that need to be made for the future of the state of Israel, and decisions that need to be made also in connection to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, are part of this vision. I will express it in using a useful tool like a GPS and Waze in our car. Because my national Waze, my destination in my national Waze is keeping Israel a secure state, Jewish democratic state in the land of Israel, but it doesn't mean on the entire land. And when this is my vision, I need to stop in a station, and this should be the peace station between Israel and the Palestinian. Because the only way to keep the values of Israel as a Jewish democratic state is to keep a Jewish majority within the borders of Israel. And in order to do so, we need to separate ourselves from the Palestinians. We need to divide the land. We need to reach peace with the Palestinians. And I believe for many years that the idea of two states for two peoples gives an answer to national aspiration of different peoples, for the Jewish people in Israel and for the Palestinians in the Palestinian state. And therefore, this is the right and just solution to the conflict. But unfortunately, I was the chief negotiator on behalf of Israel in the last two rounds of negotiations in the Annapolis process, and later in the last round of negotiations in 2013, 2014 with the Obama administration and Secretary Kerry. We didn't achieve an agreement. And therefore, there are those in Israel saying, okay, there is no partner on the other side. So why not an ex-territory, or why not taking our own decisions without achieving peace with them? So I believe that achieving peace is an Israeli interest. It's not a favor to the Palestinians. This is the only way to keep the values of Israel as a Jewish democratic state living in harmony, not in contradiction. But since I use the example of Waze, so if we don't have a partner for now, if we have problems in achieving peace between us and the Palestinians, so in a way it's traffic jams. So we cannot move forward, or we cannot stop in the station. We didn't reach the moment in which we can stop in this station. But it doesn't mean that we need to change our national GPS to Greater Israel, to annexation, to something that does not represent our vision of a Jewish democratic state. It doesn't mean that we are changing our direction, because in the other direction, in the other GPS, the GPS of Greater Israel, it means that in the end of the road, we are forcing, in a way, our children and generations to come to choose between being a Jewish or democratic state. And this is something that we cannot afford. And therefore, without changing our vision, we need to continue and move toward this. We are having problems. I try to reach peace. And frankly, I was speaking about Israel and the fact that in the last 4 rounds of elections, peace and ending the conflict, and the conflict itself was not on the table. But frankly, I think that we have a kind of a mirror picture on the Palestinian side. I don't see right now a leadership on the Palestinian side that would reach the agreement. And therefore, I do not promise anybody that there is peace just around the corner. Or I do not suggest that now we'll start renegotiate because it can add with frustration. But I do believe that we should take the steps that are needed in order to keep the road open. The last thing that I want to do is to put some bumpers or gates on my road to achieve peace in the future in order to keep Israel a Jewish democratic state. So what does it mean? It means that expansion of settlements goes against this. It will make it harder to reach peace in the future. It means that making the lives of Palestinians better is part of our interest as well. It means that we can be more open to not only Israel to invest, but to make the Palestinian economy better in order to facilitate, and hopefully when we reach the moment and point in which we can renegotiate, the atmosphere will be less with hatred or misunderstanding, but more understanding that we are having this conflict and need to find the way to give an answer to aspiration of both peoples. Frankly, this is not the situation today. I mean, as I said before, we are having a political decision not to deal with the conflict. So the situation right now, my feeling is like we are sitting in a car, for some of us, including me, frankly. The idea that Netanyahu is not the driver is quite a joy. We're quite happy about it. But it doesn't mean that without making decision, the car is still in the parking lot. It's not. My feeling, and this is why I'm so worried today, is that we are moving slowly but surely to a one state. It's not a one state solution because it's not something that will be agreed. It's not something that will keep Israel as a Jewish democratic state, but it's going to be in the future a one-state reality that would make it quite difficult to reach an agreement later, and would force generations to come to deal and to decide whether they want to give up the nature of Israel as a Jewish state or the nature of Israel as a democracy. And as I said before, this is something that we cannot afford. I do believe that if at least we can find this as a common denominator, we can have within Israel a better understanding and even a discussion within different parts of Israel's society on the basis of the same vision, but yet maybe with different approaches. I believe that this can also give a better understanding for young generation outside of Israel, what Israel means, why we make this kind of decision, and be part of the same vision. And I also believe that this can give or create better relations between Israel and the international community. It is also true that these days the international community is less involved in the conflict because, well, the world is facing different challenges. We are facing, hopefully, the end of COVID. We are still facing global warming as a huge challenge for our generation and generations to come. And countries are more focused on internal issues and less about the conflict. For some Israelis, this is the excuse to say, okay, we need no need to do something about it. But as I said before, I believe that this is our interest and not the interest of others. More than that, Israel, there's a gap between Israel and other parts of the world in an understanding what are the nature of the threats, security threats that we are facing. I do believe that if Israel, it will be clear that Israel is searching or didn't abandon the quest for peace, but yet we need to need our security challenges. The world can stand with us when it comes to our need to fight terror. It's not one or the other. It works both sides, trying to achieve peace with the Palestinians, but yet, when Hamas is attacking Israel, and it's clear that Hamas represents a religious ideology that would never accept the right of Israel to exist, and when they are targeting Israel, it's clear that Israel needs to act against it. It's not against peace, but it's against those that are not willing to live in peace with Israel. So the right strategy, after having this vision as a common denominator, is to work with the moderates in our region and the more moderates amongst the Palestinians, including the PA, the Palestinian Authority, which is the legitimate representative of the Palestinians, but when needed, to act in order to weaken terror and to weaken those that are not willing to live in peace with Israel. So we are still facing security challenges, as I said before. But I do believe that it doesn't mean that we should abandon the quest for peace with the Palestinians. And last thing that I would like to add before opening the floor to questions. I know that sometimes Israel is being criticized. The right answer is not to say that every criticism on the state of Israel means anti-Semitic ideas. As long as the acceptance of the right of Israel to exist and the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state. And therefore, when we are having this debate, when we are having this dialogue between Israel and the world Jewry on the international community, we can have a debate about different Israeli government policies. That's fine. It doesn't mean that it's against the existence of the state of Israel. As was mentioned, I was the leader of the opposition in Israel, so I criticized my own government. But yet, when it comes to the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state, and when it comes to the right of Israel to defend itself, this is something that should be the base. Don't undermine this, and then we can have a completely open, sincere dialogue about what is the right policy for the future. So at the beginning of this discussion, I told you about my parents. I was born in Israel 10 years after the state of Israel was established. Both my sons were born in Israel. And many years ago, when I decided to join politics, it was 1995, just a few weeks before the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin. And the state of Israel was with two different camps hating each other. One camp was the camp of the land of Israel, speaking about the rights of the Jewish people on the entire land, were not willing to give even an inch to the Palestinians in order to achieve peace. And on the other side was they call themselves the camp of peace, believing that the new Middle East is here and now. I felt that I'm caught in between. On one hand, I believe in the rights of the Jewish people on the entire land, but yet it's more important to keep Israel as a Jewish democratic state on part of the land of Israel and not keeping the entire land, and something that will lead to decisions about the nature of Israel as a democracy. But on the other hand, I looked at Oslo Agreement at the time, and I said, okay, why to postpone all these core issues? We need to discuss it. And therefore, I decided to join politics. It was a one-day decision, Yom Kippur decision. When I looked at both my sons, they were at the time at the age of 5 and 8, and I said, okay, I was a lawyer at the time. What kind of state, what kind of a country, what kind of reality I live, how their future is going to look like. And I decided to join politics. This is the reason that I insisted in negotiating peace with the Palestinians as a major Israeli interest. I decided to quit politics 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, when I felt that I don't have enough political power to promote this vision and idea, but I still believe that this is the right vision and this is the right policy for the future of both my sons, but also their generation in Israel. And I hope that time will come and we will see this happening, because the other option, I believe, is not a Zionist option. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Livni. Thank you, everybody else who's been posting questions in the chat. We have 357 people in attendance at the moment, and many of you are posting in the chat. Continue to post in the Q&A. Continue to post your questions in the Q&A. I'll try to combine them into single questions that we can ask, because there are a lot of questions, and I'm very grateful for it, and continue posting them. So, Minister Livni, Michael Brenner at the beginning of this talk mentioned the Amnesty International report. It's been a topic of conversation around the world, and particularly on campus here at AU over the last week. Amnesty International just issued a report labeling Israel as an apartheid state. I have two questions for you. I mean, the term apartheid state is of a lightning rod, so I want you to comment on your feelings about that term. But I also, if you possible, without going into, I guess, too much detail, because there's a lot to say, it's a 280-page report, can you say anything specifically about things that are in the report that you see as accurate or inaccurate?
Well, Israel is not an apartheid state. Israel is not an apartheid state because, as I said before, we have 20% of Israeli citizens that have completely equal rights. We are now having a government with an Arab party in the government, and we have a Muslim Arab minister within the government. And even though we have these disputes about the nature of Israel as a democracy, and yet, yes, we have this dispute about whether to add the word equality in our basic laws or not. In fact, 20% of Israelis are the minority in Israel, and as individuals, as citizens, they have equal rights. This should be clear. When I'm speaking about the decisions that need to be made with the territories that we are keeping, I believe that if we will not make the decisions of dividing the land, of separating ourselves from the Palestinians, of accepting the idea of two states, and Israel will be a state, a country with borders, with minorities within, but the minorities will have equal, as they have now, equal rights. So then we will not have this shadow of reaching the point in which we need to choose whether to give equal rights to all the millions of Palestinians that are living not within the borders of Israel, but within Jordan River and Mediterranean, or not. So this is not happening now. I heard that later they tried to say that they wanted to, not to provoke, but to raise this issue, and therefore they exaggerated. But this, I do not accept. I do not accept this report. And I, you know, sometimes when you take this kind of position, it's quite difficult to have the real decision, to have the real dialogue that need to be done. Because when we resent this kind of report, we are not open to have the real discussion. How can we deal with the territories in the future? What will happen in the future? Because we feel that it's unfair report that is biased against Israel, instead of opening a real, open, sincere discussion about the reality.
So I know you told me at the beginning that you're not going to be talking about party politics in Israel, so I'm not going to ask any of the questions that were posted about party politics. But we did get some questions from students and a couple from guests as well about what you think that can be done now to, short of the peace process, what can be done now to improve the lives of Palestinians in the territories and Israeli Arabs inside of Israel that has not been done until now?
Well, Israeli Arabs are equal rights citizens and need to be also adapted in budgets, in education, in infrastructure. And this is something that Israeli governments, especially in the last years, are trying to do. And so according to the law, they are equal rights citizens, but yet there's a lot of improvement and things that can be done within Israel. When it comes to the Palestinians in the territories or the Palestinian Authority, I believe that in understanding that in the end of the road, we want to divide the land and to create or to help them in creation of a Palestinian state, so why not to give them more possibility to build in Area C? Area C are the places that are part of the territories controlled by Israel, and for now the Palestinians cannot build or cannot plan there. According to my vision, it's going to be part of a Palestinian state. So now, why not to ease their life now? In terms of economy, Israel should help as far as we can to the Palestinian Authority. It only depends on Israel, but frankly, the international community, since it's not focused now on the conflict, are less involved in helping the Palestinian. The new American administration is doing much more. I mean, Trump administration cut the budgets to the Palestinians, delegitimized them, and therefore what the new administration is doing is really blessed and welcome. I believe that a new administration believing in two states for two people is doing the things in order to help the Palestinian economy. A different question is relating to Gaza, because the problem in Gaza is that Gaza is being controlled by Hamas. Hamas is targeting Israel, is trying to turn the conflict from a national conflict to a religious one. But I believe that there are projects that can be done and in being supervised not by Israel, because Israel left Gaza Strip. We dismantled the settlements, we pulled out our forces, but the United Nations or other organizations can supervise economic projects within Gaza Strip, like in water and electricity. And this is something that Israel should support, as long as it does not strengthen Hamas and doesn't go through Hamas, that usually they cut or they take the money for their purposes, but money that goes directly to the people in Gaza.
Okay, we're getting a lot of questions about sort of the nexus between anti-Israel rhetoric and anti-Semitism. And I'll phrase it in a couple of ways. Let me ask the question this way. I'm sort of combining several questions. Over the last several months, years, it's become more common for celebrities or people to make pro-Palestinian comments or tweets or things like that. And sometimes those who are supporters of Israel or even people within Israel respond by saying those comments are anti-Semitic. I want to know if you could sort of parse out whether that's a useful thing to do, to label opposition to specific Israeli policies as anti-Semitic, and sort of where do you draw the line between what's disagreement with Israeli policy and what's anti-Semitism?
Well, it's counterproductive. when somebody is criticizing any Israeli government policy, and when your answer, instead of listening and giving a concrete answer, your answer is that you're anti-Semitic, this is a moment in which he doesn't listen to you anymore. So I think that when criticizing any Israeli government policy is legitimate, not accepting the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state, supporting the Palestinian on the expense of the existence of Israel, this is something completely different. Therefore, take, for example, the BDS's movement. They are not fighting for establishing a Palestinian state. They do not accept the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state. And therefore, I think that the base is understanding that the Jewish people has the rights, historical, judicial, international rights to establish and to live in the nation state of the Jewish people. And the nation state of the Jewish people has the right to defend itself from terror. This is the base. Don't deny this. On top of this, we can argue what is the right policy in order to reach peace with the Palestinians. No, this is a legitimate debate. But accept these basics: the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish people, as a Jewish state, or the right of the Jewish people to live in its nation state, and the right of Israel to defend itself.
I'll ask you one more question on anti-Semitism, because we're getting a lot of them. So there's a talk about rising global anti-Semitism around the world and diminution of support for Israel in the United States, both among Jews and among non-Jews. And the question is, what can Israel and the Jewish community do to overcome that, working together?
From my experience, when you have a dialogue, even with those that maybe they have different opinions from me, or maybe they think that Israel is not acting in the right manner toward the Palestinian, or that Israel is using excessive force, or so on. So let's have a discussion on this. But don't, my experience is when I open the door, when I speak about it, when I say, listen, I believe in the rights of the Jewish people for a state. I want to achieve peace with the Palestinians. I try to do so. They are not willing to accept some of the basics. So it's not that I want to keep the territories forever, or I want to deny the Palestinians their rights in the future. This is not the situation. If you think that it's, quite easy just to establish a Palestinian state, end the conflict, and live happily ever after, this is not the situation. So criticism of Israel is one thing, but when it came, for example, voting against helping Israel to defend itself with Iron Dome, this was something that was unacceptable. It's not something that Israel is using to attack the Palestinians. It's something that Israel is using to defend itself. So I think that the obvious is not obvious anymore, and we need to understand it. Sometimes it's based on ignorance, sometimes it's a matter of positions, but I believe in a dialogue.
Getting a lot of questions about sort of internal attitudes in Israel, and people are saying things like, what you say, they understand, there are other people who have a vision for peace, but they're asking about whether you think it's realistic in terms of Israeli political attitudes, and whether in 10, 15 years you really think that the Israeli public has an appetite for concessions.
I am worried, frankly. I am less optimistic. I think that politically, it's not, it doesn't serve the political interest to speak about peace. In the last few years, those believing in peace between Israel and the Palestinians were portrayed as the enemy, as cooperating with terror, helping the enemy, and this stuff. And therefore, and since we tried, we didn't achieve peace. We have Hamas in Gaza Strip after we withdraw from Gaza. So I can understand the Israelis saying, okay, if this is the situation, let's manage the conflict. Let's not try and solve it. I'm worried because I'm worried that we will pass the point of no return. And this is why it's so important to keep the road open and not to take steps that will make it more difficult to end the conflict in the future or make it even impossible. So listen, I'm not saying that things are great because I believe in peace. I know that it's becoming less and less attractive politically to support peace. But I also know that if an Israeli leader will come with an agreement based on the idea of 2 states for 2 peoples, dividing the land, but yet keeping Israel's security, it will be supported by majority in Israel. I also know that the numbers of support are reducing, unfortunately.
We're getting, as a follow-up to that question, we're getting a lot of questions about the settlements in the West Bank and whether the Israeli government, any Israeli government, would have the sort of courage to sort of dismantle settlements that are not there for security purposes to make peace more viable and more possible.
We did it in the past. I supported the disengagement from Gaza. We dismantled settlements. It was very difficult. It tore up, the Israeli society. But yet, I think that you will not hear from any Israeli, even right-winger, that it's a very good idea to replant the settlements in Gaza Strip. Trying to say that it's going to be very difficult, yet the Palestinians understand that what we call the blocks of settlements will be part of Israel, and the 67 line should be and can be adjusted to these blocks of settlements. There are other ideas how to keep the settlements on the other side and give compensation to the Palestinians. There are new ideas of different options than 2 states for 2 peoples. What I'm saying, I do believe the 2 states for 2 peoples, including the tough, difficult decisions that are needed. This is the only way to solve the conflict, to end the conflict. But frankly, if there is another idea that brings an end to the conflict and keeps Israel a secure Jewish democratic state, I will support it.
We're getting questions about the U.S. role, possible U.S. role in bringing peace to the Middle East. I guess it's a 2-part question. Did the Abraham Accords bring the region closer to peace? And what could the United States administration do at this point to try to promote the peace process more aggressively if it was so inclined?
I truly support Abraham Accords, but frankly, it does not make peace with the Palestinians closer, because for many years, the Israeli public supported peace with the Palestinians, but the reward, the fruits of peace, was normalization with the Arab world. Because, the fruits of peace will not come from the Palestinians. It's going to be complicated. We are giving part of the land. We will face some security problems. So the whole idea was that even though we are making peace and taking some calculated risks, we can have normalization with the Arab world. What Netanyahu tried to do is to say that, okay, you see, we can have peace with Arab world without giving them territory. Which is, so what he tried to say is that we can have peace for peace also with the Palestinians which is completely, nonsense, because with these Arab countries that we are having normalization now, we didn't have a conflict on land or national conflict. They supported the Palestinian cause until they decided that normalization, their relations with Israel, is their best interest. And frankly, I think that they also understand that in the last rounds of negotiations, the Palestinians got from Israel quite fair plans and terms of agreement, and they didn't accept it. So I'm quite happy to have normalization with the Arab world, but it doesn't help to reach peace with the Palestinians, because we also believe that the Arab world can support the Palestinians, not to say push the Palestinians to make the right decision. And for now, it looks like this is not a situation anymore. And therefore, I'm saying that the fruits of peace it serves our own interest to keep Israel as a Jewish democratic state, and normalization with the Arab world it serves our interest as well, even without connection to the Palestinian. The US administration is important. Frankly, I was quite happy to see an administration believing in the idea of two states for two people. I know that President Biden believes in it. It is being expressed now by the American ambassador to Israel, saying that this is the American vision or the American policy. It's important. I do not expect the new administration to invite to a new Camp David the Israeli Prime Minister and the Palestinian President, because, it will end with huge frustration, and sometimes frustration, unfortunately, leads to violence. But I do believe that supporting what, as they are doing right now, support things that will keep the road open. Do not support new settlements activities or expansion of settlement, because it's against the interest of the idea of two states for two peoples. Stay with Israel and support Israel on Israel's security, but yet continue and express, as they are doing, that you will not accept any Israeli government policy. Annexation, thank God, is off the table right now. And therefore the situation is I do not expect the US administration to invite both sides or to force Israel to do something that is not likely to happen. But yet I do believe that they should continue in expressing their policy. These policies didn't change. This is the vision of the US administration, and they have expectations from both sides to act accordingly. Expectations from the Israeli government and the Palestinians as well.
All right, thank you. We're getting lots of questions that I'm going to combine into one about sort of the problems that are the most difficult to solve in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I've gotten some questions about the right of return, about reparations, and about Jerusalem. And if I could put those questions all together into one, I guess the question is, it's nice to talk about the possibility of a two-state solution, but, can there possibly ever be a two-state solution without the right of return, the right to reparations, and a solution to the problem in Jerusalem? And what might those solutions be?
You put everything in one question, but these are completely different issues. Let's speak about refugees. It's not the right of return, it's the claim of return. What's the idea of two states for two peoples? The idea of two states for two people basically was, as was adopted by the United Nations in 1947, is to establish a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now, as Israel was established, it was not mentioned before, but I was also Minister of Immigrant Absorption. And when I was Minister of Immigrant Absorption, I had this discussion with Condi Rice, who was Secretary of State at the time. And I said, your vision is two states for two peoples. So Israel is the Jewish state. And as Israel was established and absorbed Jews who came to Israel after the Holocaust, and then those who need to leave and escape from Arab states and came to Israel. And those who came later from Soviet Union. By definition, Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people wherever the Jews may be. Israel is a Jewish state also for some of you watching us now or having this discussion, even without living in Israel. And therefore, if ending the conflict means that each state gives an answer to national aspiration of different peoples, so the establishment of the Palestinian state is the answer to the national aspiration of the Palestinians wherever they may be. It's also the answer for national aspiration of Israeli Arabs that they are Israeli citizens and they have equal rights as individuals, but their national aspiration is getting an answer elsewhere. And frankly, these refugees are being kept in different parts of the region as political cards instead of helping them to live and have better lives in the places in which they live now. So I support the idea of two states for two peoples in order to end the conflict. I mean, if the idea is to establish a Palestinian state, I mean, we have enough states and countries in the region. What's the use of it? We are doing it in order to end the conflict and to give an answer to the Palestinians wherever they may be. So during this conflict, lots of people paid price. Some left, some Jews left Arab countries. People died, Palestinians and Israelis. People were injured. So the idea of taking us back to 48, because these refugees are from 48, when the Arab world didn't accept the right of Israel to exist, this is completely against the concept of two states for two peoples. And by explaining that to Condi Rice at the time, we got what was called Bush letter to Israel, saying that the establishment of the Palestinian state is the answer to the refugees. So this is my position, the Israeli position, the right position, I believe, to the idea of, or the claim of return of refugees to Israel. And as I said before, I evacuated Israelis from their homes, those that were born in Gaza Strip. But the concept is that some individuals may pay the price, but in the long run, we will reach an agreement. As for Jerusalem, we didn't reach an agreement. Instead of speaking about Jerusalem as such, I think that the answer to different neighborhoods within Jerusalem is going to be easier, what we call Jewish, Arab. The most sensitive issue is a very tiny place. It's what we call the Holy Basin. It's the Old City, it's Temple Mount, and the Western Wall. And we didn't reach an agreement about it. There are different ideas, but frankly, it is a combination of national aspiration, of religious connection. And I hope that by using Jerusalem, and Hamas is now abusing the situation in Jerusalem in order to turn the conflict from a national conflict into a religious one. And religious conflicts are more difficult to be solved because it's not about territory, it's not about rights, it's about something that is more complicated to solve.
So there's actually a very poignant question here that I'm going to rephrase, and I think it gets maybe to some of the differences in views in changing views in the United States towards Israel. One of the people in the questionnaires asked, they grew up believing in that separate was not equal. In the United States, as you know, we had you're a lawyer, we know we had the famous Brown versus Board of Education decision,
yes,
in which America ruled that segregation was not legal, separate was not equal. And the question that this person is asking is, in Israel, you're sort of making this argument that we need to sort of possibly separate Israelis and Palestinians and sort of make them equal that way, but separate is not equal. Now you've hinted at your answer, I think, of what you said just now, but I want you to be able to respond to that feeling.
Yes, I think that those that are speaking about it do not understand that there's a difference between the state of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian citizens and the Palestinians who live in the territory. It's completely different issues. And it's funny because I'm a true supporter of two states for two peoples. I believe that it gives an answer to national aspirations also of the Palestinians. And then just a few months ago, after I wrote an article in New York Times, in Washington Post, somebody said, well, those believing in two states are racist. They don't want to live with Palestinian, which is completely nonsense. There are two possibilities for me. One is to live in one state between Jordan River, Mediterranean Sea. The meaning is that as peoples, Jewish and Palestinians, we will not express our national aspiration. It's something that maybe is difficult for Americans to understand. What does it mean to be a nation state? But this is the concept. And within this nation state, each and every citizen has equal rights. We live together. It's not separate, but equal but separate, not at all. We live together. They are equal rights citizens. The idea is to build a different country to the Palestinian in which they will express their rights as a nation. When you are speaking about the American decisions and the issue of separate but equal referred to different groups or different citizens within the same country. This is not the situation that I'm talking about. Within Israel, I agree, I completely agree. Equality doesn't mean separate but equal. But between our two conflict, we have a national conflict between two peoples. So what is more just than giving each people a state to express their national aspiration?
So I'm going to ask two last questions.
And this was as I continue in saying, this was agreed all the time by the international community as well. This the solution for the conflict. Those saying that they do not accept it, they also mean that they are not willing to give the Palestinians the right to live in a state of their own.
Well, I guess the response to that would be, based on the questions I'm getting in the chat, in the Q&A, is that separate but equal, it may be an issue if you have two states, but the trend among sort of people who want a novel solution is the one-state solution. And is the one-state solution growing in support? And is there still, I mean, I know the diplomatic community and much of the world community is still in favor of a two-state solution, but there seems to be growing support for a one-state solution.
So as I said before, my concern is that we will reach, it's not going to be a one-state solution, unfortunately. We can reach a point in which it will be one-state reality, and this can lead to decisions that, like was suggested before, not as a decision, but as a wrong decision. This is why I truly believe that we should avoid reaching this point, because the option will be to give equal rights to everybody, and the meaning is going to be that there's not going to be a Jewish state nor a Palestinian state, but something that will have within an ongoing conflict. And this is something that I believe that we should avoid.
Okay, I'll ask one last question. It comes from one of our faculty members, Guy Ziv, and I hope it doesn't violate the rules for this talk. He says, does Ms. Livni entertain the possibility of making a political comeback down the road? Either way, who does she see as a future leader or leaders in the post-Netanyahu era?
No, I said before that I don't want to relate to this question. Frankly, personally, as I said before, I decided to join politics on one Yom Kippur. I do not make plans for the future, so I never say never, but I'm not making these kind of plans today. But who knows?
But
I don't know.
I actually have time for one more question, so I'll ask it. So it's interesting.
And instead of using names, I hope that Israel will have a leader believing in what I believe is the right vision for the state of Israel, and will have the courage to make the decisions as I just portrayed in this discussion.
Okay, so maybe I have time for one last question. So you yourself told your sort of life story, right? Your parents were Cherut, connected to the Irgun, and sort of you moved to sort of the center left. And if you look at the Israeli political system today, the true left, or the founding of the state left, is now getting smaller and smaller. And the people on the left are now people who are centrists or former rightists or sort of moving to the left. Is that good for promoting sort of the peace process and new ways of looking at the conflict? Or is that sort of problematic, that there isn't a solid left anymore in Israel like there was 30, 40 years ago?
You know, you're not the only one saying that your parents were right-wing and you are turning to center and maybe left. This is not a situation, because what I believe that I express the same values of my parents, because they were thinking, Menachem Begin in 1967 was thinking about or offering equal rights and Israeli citizenship to the Palestinians. And therefore, if you believe in equal rights and the values of Israel as a Jewish democratic state, you need to choose between Greater Israel and Jewish democratic state. So this was my choice. It's not against the values of my parents, but it's according, because the other option is to have the entire land, but yet choosing between being a Jewish or democratic state. I think that there is something I criticized, or I said before, that the idea of not touching this sensitive issue is worrying me, because we are going slowly but surely to a one-state reality. But yet there is good news in having this government, because I think after years of incitement and portraying left-wing as cooperating with the enemy, and so, because of political needs, because they need each other. And this is a government which is very narrow, and you have the different fractions within this government. So in order to end this discussion with a more optimistic note in the end, I think that this can be also the beginning of a true discussion. Where are we heading? What can be done? Instead of thinking about the other, okay, you are left-wing, so you're taking care about the Palestinians, not about Israel as a Jewish state. You are right-wing, so you want to continue the occupation. Let's have this discussion. And maybe, even though their political decision is not to have this discussion, maybe it's like in a jigsaw, in a puzzle. There are different pictures, different parts of the jigsaw, and the real question is, how can we build this thing together and make the decision? So I don't believe in a unity just for the sake of unity, or unity because we have enemies. I believe in unity that is based on a shared vision. Maybe, and hopefully, this is an opportunity to draft and to write and to agree on this vision. And I hope that it will be mine, frankly.
Well, thank you very much. On that note, I want to thank you, Minister Livni, for a fascinating talk and for taking such a wide variety of questions. And thank you to everybody who joined.
Thank you.
And thank you for all of the questions. And I wish you all well. Thank you very much. Kol Tuv, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.